Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer. We've recently launched our Patreon page, which can be found at cynicaldeveloper.com/Patreon. If you aren't familiar with Patreon, it's an easy way for those who are interested in this show to help out by simply pledging a small amount each month in sponsorship. Now that could be as little as $5 a month, which is about £3.80, or as much as you like. You will enable us to dedicate more time creating more content to help you, including videos, more blog posts, and even more shows. So if you can, head over to cynicaldeveloper.com/Patreon and get involved. In this episode, we complete our extended dive into AI with Ed Yau. This is part 3 of 3 in the series. A lot of people will have probably been tasked with building some sort of AI in their current jobs. I know, being a contractor, I've worked in a few places where bots have been the go-to thing lately. So, what's going on in the world of bots?
Yeah, so we're finally getting onto bots. Bots, I suppose, is where I first started looking at AI. So it's sort of my gateway drug, if you like. But I think it's my perception is that the hype has died down somewhat amongst techies, in that we sort of see what it is now, and it's probably not as exciting as when it first arrived on the scene. I think some people in the media are still kind of hyping it up, but I think the difficulty has been that the UX, a lot of bots that we are used to seeing, isn't that great. There are some reasons. Obviously, mostly these bots are created by digital teams with a similar process to building a website in reality. So you design them by a UX person. They might have conversations that are prepared by a content creator. And my point is that these people are not specialists. So if the smarts in building AI into software is with the creators currently, then there's a learning curve before you get anything good. So right at the beginning, you're going to see lots of examples of bad things coming out. So in fact, I mean, thinking about it, one of the only examples that really stands out for me is a bot by ASOS, who are an online clothes reseller in the UK. And they've got a sort of personal shopper bot that I think has got quite an effective UX. So you can do things like you can snap an outfit in the street and you get a recommendation on a similar one, and it keeps popping up with things it thinks you might like. And most of the time they're pretty on the money. So I think that's effective because they've used the right things. They use the right elements of AI to make it work. So they've also got some sort of cognitive service which looks at, a picture and is able to then extrapolate some data out of it and then link it to a recommendation engine, which understands, what it's got in stock, what's selling well, etc. So I think one of the issues with the sort of older ways of building bots is it very much relies on a content creator. Which means that you need a lot of resource to build the bot in the first place from a content perspective, and then you've got to keep investing in that resource to keep on top of stuff, because the world's very rarely static, and people might be more tolerant of websites that are out of date, but when you're talking to a bot, somehow your expectations elevate a few notches, don't they?
Yeah.
So there are some newer approaches that I've been seeing. So last time I came on, it was having only worked on bots where we had some machine learning around the edge. So basically you have an NLP, a natural language processing engine, which looks at what people are saying, translates it into an intent of what the user might want, and that intent could have been triggered from a bus impress. And then you've got a conversation flow that is either directed in code or it's managed in some sort of logic tree. But I think generally what I'm seeing is the world is is moving away from the idea that the bot is a project in its own right, because I think the reality is that the technology is not ready to be that right now.
Yeah.
So what I'm seeing is the consensus is moving to the bot being part of a conversation platform. So that conversation platform can have people involved in the workflow because you need them to plug the gaps. And because if the AI element is applied in a basic way, as it is still with a lot of bots, I think, then you need that to make the bot work to that 100%. So maybe if the bot works to 70%, being able to help people what they need based on the content, they need something to plug the 30%.
Yeah.
And that'll still be quite a good bot, that 70% bot. So I've noticed Gartner. I don't know if you heard of them, but they're a technology consultancy based in the US. They're quite influential in the technology space. And what they are strong at is doing technology surveys. Recently I noticed they'd done a survey of conversation platforms. So they're naturally shaping the industry and the ecosystem that way already, what that terminology. But basically these conversation platforms, where they've caught companies' attention is in customer service, because if you've got call center staff who are effectively working off scripts anyway, it probably doesn't feel like a massive departure to automate some of that aspect. And if you happen to have a lot of data that people are talking, then you've got a lot of data at least to test with, if not train on. So now that I've worked on a few more complex bots, I can see why there's some growing acceptance that the logic to manage a natural conversation with breadth is just too complicated. And these simple tree bots have sort of got very obvious limitations. So even if you throw weeks of content resource at it, the results still ultimately are not that impressive. These bots don't really learn. Obviously, you can tune them based on what people are saying and interpret those things to mean different things, based on classifying those intents. But if you want to make your bot better, basically you're gonna have to pay someone to create more content, review metrics, do some more content, review metrics. Basically, this is the old classic website life cycle, isn't it? Even if you really speed it up. So the old enterprise way would have been people in-house test it, it goes around the loop, you do some more dev, you release it. The next stage up is when you basically just run off metrics, as you do with marketing websites, where you're just looking for conversion rates, what people are clicking on, what they're not clicking on, and trying to lead them to have the desired behavior. Building bots for most people is still a similar thing, where you sort of analyze the conversation drop off. For example, if you're trying to get a bot that's leading to sale, you're analyzing the conversion drop off at various stages, and then you're trying to tune the bot to say the right things at the right points. I still think that's basically old thinking. My view is if you want more from these bots, then you've got to really lean on that machine learning. And there are some good ways of doing this now, even if you basically don't want to build your own TensorFlow model and trying to go down that route. So you've got older frameworks like BotKits and Watson Assistant that rely on conversation flows to be creating a tree by these content creators. So the sort of newer approaches that I'm seeing are with things like Razacore, and Microsoft are also going down that sort of route where they're effectively building a machine learning tree in the background based on conversations. So they've got a project called Project Conversation Learner now, which is in private preview, is the terminology they use. So that ultimately means that you can feed it lots of examples of conversations, and it will learn how to respond based on those with real conversation In fact, basically mirroring what people are saying. So that's relatively exciting. I think if you want to build something super scalable, then that seems like a good place to go. So another trend I've seen is that rather than using the natural language processing, most of the bots that are good to use actually rely on buttons and carousels. Because if you're using NLP, basically it's almost like a completely open world scenario you've got. The user can do anything, and then you've got to react to that and do something sensible. And if you've got an infinite number of things they could say, well, you're basically going to lose some of the time, aren't you? So it's much smarter, much easier to give the user some buttons because you've basically got predefined paths. Each of those paths will lead somewhere where you've designed it already.
Yep.
So that's happening. Even these self-learning bots, I think that is still helpful because it cuts down the amount of data you need to actually have a sensible result.
Yeah. So you mentioned two terms there, Rasa and conversation learner. Now, there's been a few things that I've come across lately and heard people talking about in the media, which is the likes of Google. They have bots now ringing local businesses to find out information about them. Is that what Rasa is and conversation learner?
Yeah, so you're talking about Google Duplex, aren't you?
Yeah.
So that's a very advanced implementation of the same types of model that Razacore and Conversation Learner are using.
Okay.
So it's effectively using machine learning to decide what to say next. So if you go back to what I was talking about last year, which is the first, maybe second generation bots, you actually just have that machine learning around the edge for that NLP. You use it to understand roughly what a user is saying to you, and then you use that intent to run some code based on the conversation state. So if you build your bot the right way, the decision of what to do next will be data driven in some aspect. So it will come from a conversation tree that's being driven by a content creator. But the problem is that I think in reality most conversations are not very linear. So you'll jump off at a tangent, you'll come back. So if you've got a very nice design conversation where you're just following the happy path, you won't have designed those places where you can handle those anomalies or people just being goofy. So the other problem is that, obviously that comes with experience. You can then go off and design those branch offs and bring them back to the conversation, for example. But the other problem is that these tree-based bots are just very intense to maintain because with any logic-based system, when you make changes, you're supposed to carry out a regression test, aren't you? So you do it in software, so you should do this with a bot. But if it gets really complicated, the complexity of that regression test is basically O to the power n in computing terms. So it means it gets exponentially harder as the number of conversation paths increases.
Yep.
So that's not obviously sustainable in any way, shape, or form. So effectively, what that means is if you start off building the bot with one person to test it, you then need 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You need the entire team to test it eventually. It's the same bot, just do more things.
Sure.
So again, you could apply some automation on that if you wanted to, but the complexity of that also grows at O to the power n. So the different approach is what Rasa and Conversational Learner are doing. So you don't write code to decide what to do next. You don't ask a person to tell it what to do next by designing a tree. Instead, what you've got is a machine learning model which understands what to do next. And it will still ultimately run some code, but what code to run is encapsulated in what they call an LSTM model. So that stands for long short-term memory, and it's a type of deep neural net that is structured to store and understand short sequences. So if you have a conversation over a number of weeks, it's probably a struggle, but over a relatively, something like a 10 message interaction, this sort of network works really well. So the point is, if you have data on real conversations, this can go straight into your model, and that teaches it based on what I've said, what you should say, and what the next thing is to say. Next thing, and then when you say next thing, it knows what to say after that. If you don't, now conversation data is not that hard to come up with actually in reality, because you can scrape Facebook, you can scrape lots of things that most companies are doing at the moment. You'll have some sort of data you could use, but if you don't, then what people do is they bootstrap it by just having pretend conversations between themselves. So you might still want to run some regression tests, but you don't necessarily need to worry that new conversations have broken old ones, because effectively what you do when you do a refresh is you build your model again with a new data set, and all you're doing is you're reviewing your data set to make sure it's correct before you put it in. So after it's finished training, you can be confident that it should behave as required based on the model if the model has not changed. So over time, this model just keeps getting better. So your bot keeps learning what people are saying to it, and it keeps adapting. So I think from the theory side, it just makes sense, and then it becomes building the bot becomes more of a data scientist workflow than I guess what we call a traditional developer workflow. And personally, I think that's pretty cool. So don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting this would be a good fit for every bot problem, because you may work in an industry where you've got some requirements where the behavior needs to be more transparently visible to regulators. So you might still want to build parts of it in a tree or all of it in a tree, and that's your trade-off for that requirement. But if you're working in the call center, you've run a call center, for example, you've got lots of people on the phones, and you might have issued some scripts, you might have recorded those conversations, but you're treating those almost like black boxes, aren't you?
Yep.
So as long as you sample some of those conversations, you listen back to them, and they seem to be behaving as you expect, you'd be relatively happy as a call center manager, wouldn't you? So that's basically what we're saying here. Ultimately, we're observing behavior, and if that behavior is okay, if it's just conversation chit chat, then it's not as highly prized as if you're profiling people's medical results. It's not as regulated in many industries. But this is actually quite a common way of building some of these bots. So they're componentized to have different approaches for different areas of conversation. And I know that Raza is particularly popular with a lot of bot startups because the core algorithm is open source. You can tune it, you can read the code, and the cost base is easy to manage because there's no cost per message as you might have with a cloud service. So you get inundated with reviews, and all of a sudden you can't pay your hosting bill, and you're taken offline. You don't have any of those issues. It's a steady fixed cost.
Yeah.
More steady. So the thing about Raza is there's an enterprise version. So if you had a go, you realize it was really good, but then you realize you wanted to implement it, and you weren't sure about basically building the whole DevOps side of things and hosting it yourself, and managing the whole retraining cycle, you basically get Raza to sell you their enterprise version, and they'll give you support to manage all that. Sounds quite a good bootstrap for these projects. But project conversation learning is shaping up as well also. But at the moment it's deployed as like an enhancement to Lewis. So Lewis, I don't know if you come across it, is basically Microsoft's Nlp Engine. It stands for Language Understanding Intelligence Service. this is a much quicker route to getting access to this sort of technology, but it's currently only in private preview, which probably means that before it goes GA, there'll be quite a lot of steps. So if you want to use it in production, you're not going to have any support right now, and that may be a problem for you. It may not be. It also means that the documentation is a little bit sparse, but otherwise it's interesting, and it's more prescriptive in the way it takes you through how you should be creating these bots, and it also comes with a web UI as well. So in effect, Project Conversation Learner is probably most of what you get in Rasa Enterprise for a lot less. So I think in summary, I would say the tools are getting much better, but building a bot can still be fairly complex unless you know what the right tool sets are to go with.
Yeah, because even still, it's there's still complex decisions to be made there, and it's not something I think you could go blindly into and suddenly be really good at it. So what do these complexities really mean for the architecture of bots and that?
So I think it's again going back to analogies. So software development in the 1970s, where you don't have any patterns. So people are discovering patterns at the moment, but many patterns, obviously, because we're developers, will lean quite heavily on our experiences of building software. So if we say that, and we say basically the bot is just another software system, you can use all the methods that you would use for building software. So you might do DDD to understand the domain. You might use that to understand the seams, and you might decide, okay, I'm going to go microservices. I'm going to have different services, different teams. And then you might say, well, you've got different boundary contexts, and those that fit those teams to Conway's law, and you give each team ownership of some of those services. That's a standard way you might approach the architecture of a system. The same applies to the bots. So basically, unless you're building something really simple, you're not like to have one bot that does everything. Just like you're not going to have one service that does everything. But you could make one bot to rule them all. So, I know, sorry. So a common pattern is to have a dispatcher service or like a triage bot as a bit of a facade sitting over a load of other bots. Obviously, you can go multi-layer with this. So you structure the bots to contain certain areas of conversation. And an obvious thing to do probably in a company is to have, in a call center, you might have different departments. We've all been on the end of a phone where you might ring a company and they transfer you to another department to answer the next query, and by the end of the conversation you've spoken to 6 people.
Yep.
Because the first person doesn't know what you need, or they're not allowed to tell you what you need to know, the way they're organised. So I mean that's probably quite a nice way of modelling a complicated bot. You have bots with their own specific knowledge, domain knowledge, and you have some way of charging between them. If handoffs, if you like. And one handoff might be to escalate it to a person if they detect that someone's really unhappy, for example.
Yeah.
So, so I think that's quite a safe way of doing it, and doing it that way means that rather like when you build a software system, you might choose to use different technologies for different services because it just suits. Well, the libraries you can get suit that particular program language or that stack.
Yep.
So if you do it this way, then potentially you could have different approaches to each different bot. And some of them you might have people designing conversations. If you're in a very heavily regulated industry with some tough compliance requirements, for others you might go down the full machine learned route, where you've just given it a million conversations, and it now is able to replicate your perfect call center employee without anyone knowing.
Yeah.
So therefore, there's a lot of considerations really. But this landscape is evolving. It's moving fast, and people are still investing in technology all the time. So last time I was commenting on the Microsoft Bot Framework v3. So basically saying that if you do it in .NET, it's almost like they've taken ASP.NET MVC and they've just changed the names of the classes. It almost felt a bit like that. Now they're working on Bot Framework 4, which is out in public preview, and lots of things have changed. So now there's much more emphasis on middleware, because it's this view that you need to scale these layers of bots, and having middleware is one way of doing it. That is an easy place to go. So I think that's what's happening in the bot space. But I do your technical blog on my Medium, and there's quite a good comparison of different bot stacks I've got on there, which is written last year, so it's all out of date. But I think it's I'm planning to update it quite soon.
Yeah, I think with the rate that things are changing, I think keeping it up to date is going to be almost a full-time job in itself.
Yeah, hopefully. We'll see.
Yeah. It's been a really interesting deeper dive into AI and machine learning and bots than what we talked about in episode 44. So it's been good. I've really enjoyed the conversation about it, and I think I've taken away a much better understanding for actually what AI really is, and not just what the hyped version of what the media would have you think that AI is. It's not going to come and snatch everything that we hold dear away from us anytime soon. But it's actually it's quite interesting, but it's still quite a demanding area if you want to do anything with any real impact.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. But I think if that is the case, then I've fulfilled my mission brief for today.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, it's thanks for spending the time to come and talk to us about it. And undoubtedly, I probably expect you to probably come back in another 12 months and tell us where we are, where we're up to. And with the way that things exponentially grow, the conversation could be completely different. It could be that AI and machine learning have come on so far that it is the end of humanity, and that we all need to panic and leave the Earth and go and live on the moon or something. But you never know.
Yeah, or you could be talking to an Ed boss I've developed.
Yeah, I guess. And but then how do I even know that this is you that I'm talking to? How do we know that AI hasn't already got smart enough that it's purposefully failing the Turing test now because it doesn't want us to know that it's that smart? There's a scary thought to end on, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed being on. Yeah. Awesome,
great stuff. So that concludes our deep dive into machine learning and AI. So thank you to everyone out there for listening today to The Cynical Developer. I'm James Stoddart, and you've been listening to Ed Yau talking about machine learning and AI. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website where you can find all the resource links, show notes for each episode. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and help The Cynical Developer to reach more developers around the globe.